begin my speech in two arguments in my speech. First, on why private contractors offer you beneficial loans in a way that benefits them, creating perverse incentives for the government and making sure that projects are enacted in such a way that benefits the interests of the corporate elite instead of the interests of the public and their representatives. Secondly, about how debt is expensive and how having this accessibility to money means projects are more likely to go over budget, more likely to require a state bailout in the end. Before that, just a bit of framing. Construction firms still build the projects on both sides of the house. What changes is specifically the funding, or the primary funding source. So on our side, we wanted to be state subsidies, meaning that whatever budget they need is allocated from taxes, written into budgetary agreements of the coalition, agreed upon by the representatives, and then if they need more money, then they need to request the state for more money, and the state needs to approve more money. On their side, it's loan agreements with private contractors. It means if you get the money from private investment banks, from an investment fund, a bank, a pension fund, etc. I want to get into my first argument. Private contractors offer you beneficial loans to build in a way that benefits them and how they create perverse incentives. Starting by illustrating who are these private contractors and why do they have strong corporate narratives. Note, investment arms are always invested in many different things, many different projects, many different companies, and they want all of them to succeed. Yes, they want this specific project to succeed. But government projects are often not the most lucrative, not the most trustworthy, not the most long-term. What they do give you is uniquely power over and influence over the government. What they care about is their general bottom line. If they can build the sewage plant, or the highway, or the bridge, or the port in such a way that benefits their own interests, i.e., China building a port close to the copper mines in whatever state they're neo-colonizing, that is directly in the interests of these banks, and that is what they'll try to do. Note, the rich people who own these corporations seek any way possible to influence the government and skirt public regulations. So the rich Jewish people who fund Harvard, I'm allowed to say this, the rich Jewish people who fund Harvard do it because it directly gives them leverage and influence over Harvard, meaning that even outside of just determining which projects Harvard do or don't, it means that at any moment they have sort of an axe hovering over Harvard's head saying, we remind you, we have power over you. Let's get into then, how do they act upon these incentives? First, they use it to screw over other competitors. This looks like building a bridge that blocks a river that a competitor uses for heavy shipping. So instead, that shipping now goes by trains, and let's say I control the trains in that area. So I'm able to, by blocking a river, divert traffic and transport from ships to trains. It looks like building a new highway that reaches the areas where your farmers live, if you're Monsanto, but instead of the area where your enemies' farmers live, meaning that you're the one who gets a profit from this highway existing, giving you an unfair advantage. No, even if it's not a direct advantage over competitors, at the very least you're getting yourself preferential treatment. If there's a question of where a new port is built, and you insist on building that port specifically in the place on funding, you offer beneficial loans if that port is built specifically close to where you own many factories, then you're the one who benefits most from the novel existence of that port. It also looks like screwing over regulations. So let's say a factory on a clean river destroys the river, and I might not be allowed to do that. But if an energy plant or a sewage plant is already polluting that river now has a different status, and if I build a factory in that river that isn't a significant harm, meaning that if I own land downstream of that river and I want to be able to turn that land into factories, I want to build a sewage plant or a power plant upstream. It also looks like parts of like wanting certain areas to wanting certain areas where I hold land to be rezoned. So if I pressure for a new highway to be built through a specific valley where I know that I'm able to quickly and easily buy land or already own land, and then I turn that highway turn that forest from a natural reserve into a place where a highway runs through, I'm also allowed to build industrial things around that highway. It looks like wanting to improve the living conditions in specific parts of a city or specific cities in a country where you want to build shop. So if you're, let's say, invested in Amazon and you want and Amazon are building a factory in Minneapolis, then you might insist on building new projects that are correlated to an Amazon factory in Minneapolis. Let's take a POI. Closing?
Yeah, so money doesn't come from businesses, it comes from banks, which tend to lend to everyone. How many banks do you specifically own specific lots of land or specifically marine
Banks
parks?
and investment arms invest in specific projects that give them returns on dividends. Those projects are either manufacturing, or they're transport, or they're just owning land, renting it out for various purposes. In other words, the three examples that I've been returning to in my speech are exactly the three primary methods for banks and investment arms to make profit by loaning to companies. Let's talk about now, it's also a tool for lobbying. So you can actively use this leverage to get other things from the government. So if the governor promised the people to build a new public park, the state isn't going to subsidize it, and it's hard for them to find a loan for it because the park isn't profitable, they can't show a repayment of the loan. But if they can be offered good loan conditions by anyone who wants a tit for tat from the governor. And this could be relaxing regulations, passing some law that the corporation wants to pass in the city, or giving them preferential treatment. It's not even a visible tit for tat. It can also just be creating a tit for tat relationship where you know that you owe me, and in order for me to continue funding your project that are otherwise unfundable, you want me to continue funding you. Let's talk about debt. Debt is more expensive, period. So you owe interest on every dollar that you take out. This interest is significant if you don't have an immediate repaying strategy. Note, since these public projects often run over budget and often run over time, being public construction projects limited by a variety of factors and just badly planned and managed by governments, you know this, you read the news, you know how many of these projects go 3, 5, 10 times over budget. We think that in the first place, they're not going to be offered very good loans unless, of course, the corrupt and perverse incentives that I explained before. Now that means that the very same project is just going to cost you more to build than if you get money in other ways, if you offer bonds to raise more money, if you raise taxes. These projects are also more likely to go over budget on their side. So it's easier for you to plan badly. You won't have to appeal to the state for more subsidies. You will just have to appeal to the private contractor for more loans, which you'll be able to get. When worse comes to worse and you need the state to bail you out, the state will have no choice but to bail you out, which means that you're incentivized to follow risky strategies that allow you supposedly in the short term to realize your goals, but in the long term end up costing the state far more, both in interest and in bailout costs. For all of these reasons, opening government.
I'd like to thank that speaker for that very fine speech, and I'd like to invite the Leader of Opposition to open the case for their side. Here.
The best thing that can happen for a state-owned enterprise is that private companies get in and help it to get into better management in order to achieve the goals, in order for the citizens to be happy in the long term, in order for the quality of life to actually become better. And this will be our case in this debate. 2 points of framing before that. First, you think that in most likely cases that we're talking about, there will be several lenders for each project. We think that this is the incentive of the state to prevent huge influence of these people. We think that this is the incentive of even other lenders to actually do that, and know that other lenders are in on it, and it's easier to actually get the money than get one lender for billions and billions of dollars. Secondly, I think that because of specific political pressure and because of laws many times on these banks, there will be transparency as to who is actually doing these loans, when the loan is due, how it is done, etc. We think it's hugely important. We think that this in of itself has some of what we get from OG. Let's do one point of and then we move on. They say, look, they will use it to screw over competitors. Firstly, this river bridge thing and really get lost. I don't think this is a likely scenario. And the other scenario about being really cheap, making something really cheap to help you, I think that this is in general good in order that it actually helps more people in general and it makes better infrastructure in general. But moreover, Yeah, but last I think most SOEs are monopolies in terms of so we don't think that it screws over competition in the line of work, which is the most important thing. Okay, let's move on to understand why we have better management on our side of the house. First, let's understand the incentives of the state. We think that, firstly, SOEs create a moral hazard with political interference. Nepotism and things like that. I think that this is not only in dictatorships, but mostly in democracies. In the end, there is one minister for transportation and things like that that needs to decide who is the director of this company. And even if he doesn't decide himself, he decides what budget they get and needs to approve that. That means he has huge leverage over who to get there, and he has huge incentives to get the people he likes into this company because these are lucrative jobs for very long term. And he many times doesn't know any better and doesn't know other people in this because most ministers aren't there from them. But moreover, many times in dictatorships, government, and things that aren't so democracy, you need to actually please other people and powerful people, specifically oligarchs and such, for actually to make them happy. So you give them positions and power inside these companies in order for you to stay in power on this day. But when you have a democracy, it's also worse because of elections that cause you short-term incentive for these things. Notice, most projects that we're talking about are extremely long-term. When you create long, new, clean water things, it creates 10 years until you get clean water inside all of the country. When you're talking about a new infrastructure project like the HS2 in England, you're talking about tens of years, and no state election is an incentive to make it better because of that. Just don't care about it. Many times in dictatorship, you rely on the military to build and help those things, and we all know how bad the military is. Now, the comparative, as we said, is multiple banks, and here is crucial to understand the incentive. Yes, sometimes it can be also big companies, but mostly who lends money is banks or other countries and things like that. They think, no, we'll get to PY later. First, we think that the incentive of private banks is they want the loan back, which is very basic. We think that it's crucial also for them to actually give the loans to companies that are as functioning as possible, that it is likely that they will have to can get the loan back in terms of that they get money, that they are still managing good enough for them to get money from other citizens, from selling train tickets, anything like that. But moreover, they don't want to look like loan sharks because they loan all the time and lend to many other places, and there is big competition between banks. If a bank or a country looks like a loan shark and that it harms you in the long term, then nobody will actually going to use it. So there's an incentive to actually be nice to you in terms of not being aggressive. But moreover, in terms of the long term, they have more incentive for the long term in terms of their prestige. Many times people who work in this business for 20, 30 years and want to work on the prestige of the bank for the long term. They care for it. Secondly, in terms of shareholders, many times pension shareholders, systematic shareholders who carry that for a long time. So they want the share to be happier and to be better, not in 4 years, but in actually 30 years in most of these cases. So how are the mechanisms that they make it better? First, they can just request other directors specifically for these projects, or a director's form a batch of minimum qualification. Secondly, most likely they are sending due diligence firms. This is crucial because it means that you look at the project from another angle. Specifically the problem of budget and going over budget, yes, it will still happen on our side, but it happens less when you have a third and fourth set of eyes looking into it from different perspectives and actually asking themselves, is that right or is that not right, and trying to do that as best as possible, because rather than asking and seeing the people inside understand if that is actually something that is something that is likely. We think that the interest rate for loans is much lower when there is less risk, when there is better management. This is crucial because this is exactly how you pressure these places to run good. This is exactly where you prevent the corruption and create better management. Why is it so important? Firstly, the amount of money people spend on things that are the friend of someone director means that literally it can make the project from 10 billion to 15 billion because you buy concrete from the other places and things like that. Secondly, in terms of stability, the ability to build a stable thing that happens for 50 years and actually doesn't crash in 10 years is the thing that means that you have clean water for all of these things. Thirdly, in terms of literally electricity, look at the place, for example, in South Africa, who literally don't have electricity all the time and it crashes because of things like that. This is crucial. Before I move on, second house.
Yeah, who decides how much these companies borrow on your side? Is it the central government or is it the directors of the companies themselves?
We think that this is the SOEs that do that. We could be with some advice from the central government, at least that there is still the regulation. Let's move on to why we have more stable companies. Firstly, because of political pressure, many times the funds are getting retrieved or no more funds are getting there. Think that when you actually want to hand food before the election, like there is in India, then you actually need to cut from other places, and of course you don't want to raise taxes or anything like that, so you don't get funds to these places. When you need to give to a specific sector which you want to cave to, and you don't get to other sectors or other provinces where you know you're going to lose in the election anyway, so it doesn't matter to you. When there is a minority that just don't care about, or you know that they weren't going to vote for you, so you take the money out of it. Why is this crucial? Because it means that your ability as a project, a big project, to know that you're continually getting funded is much less there. Huge impact of that. Firstly, worst management is going to get in the first place if they don't know that they can finish the project and build it. Secondly, we think that the company cannot sustain itself many times because it means that it cannot actually, the project can be stopped halfway, which is the worst because it means also harm for people and harm in terms of frauds and hazards, and it doesn't help anymore. And thirdly, we think that in most of these cases, that's it. I call you to oppose.
I'd like to thank that speaker for that very fine speech, and I'd like to invite the Deputy Prime Minister to continue to speak to their side. Here.
Three, two, one. I'll do a few very simple things in this speech. I'm going to talk about incentives, and then I'm going to talk about why tainting through lobbying, even if it happens only in some of the cases, is a big enough impact to win this round. Finally, a little bit on that if I have time. What does LO say? Incentives of the state are bad, banks are good. If I take down any one of these, this is enough to take down on the fact that maybe comparatively both are bad or comparatively both can be good. Let's talk about why banks aren't great. Two reasons for this, by our characterization of banks' incentives over theirs of getting back the loan. Note that if you influence the government through lobbying, if you make it so politicians will now approve a policy that's preferential for you or build a plan somewhere, you don't need to require interest rates that are as high on the policy, which is why optically it looks better to accept a proposal by a company that requires lower interest rates because it knows it will engage in the tit for tat that Ayal describes, which is why it's not the good kind of banks that they talk about that are going to be chosen as part of this policy, because they're not the ones that seem as if in the next 4 years they would waste the least money. It's the ones that don't have an incentive to necessarily get back the loan because they're getting rewards in some other way. Secondly, if it was true that the government was as inefficient as they explain, note that they don't actually have to engage in all of the good things that they say banks will, because the banks will always be more efficient than the government. So insofar as the government is bad, banks have no incentive to be good, and they still have reasons to not be good if they can avoid it. They have to waste their time and having their quantum computers crunch the numbers in Western countries where it is more important to prove efficiency and things like that. So I think there's no incentive for banks to be good. Lastly, why are states good and accountable? In dictatorships, this notion probably doesn't really matter. If it were talking about China and things of that sort, it's probably companies that are owned by the state. They would never allow a company that has different incentives and might be better. We think that in democracies, it is likely that the reason why the companies are accountable to the state is simply because budget approval is something that requires a majority or often even a supermajority in order to approve. We think that this is the point at which other parties are able to scrutinize what you're using with the money. Local media can do that, and even if both fail, international media can do that, which means that even if it's not necessarily going to cost you the election, why not invest in just having another wing to scrutinize the other wing that makes decisions about funding? It is simply not clear why you can't do the same things that bank would on their side. Let's talk about lobbying and the types of policies that get through. I want to be very clear about why it is that banks are also biased, right? Citibank is invested within large investment funds, the only ones that are big enough in order to currently fund real estate projects. In fact, Petrobras in Brazil was such an investment fund. In their, the corporation themselves is often the investment fund because they have the existing infrastructure, they have the most knowledge, and they have the most money that's necessary in order to afford these projects in the short term. So it's often the corporations themselves. Even if it is just the bank, note what this means for Citi. If they are invested in a specific real estate fund, in a specific corporation like Petrobras, and that corporation collapses, this means 2008, once again, they have no way of paying back liabilities, so obviously their primary incentive as a bank is to make sure that where their assets are held, the company with which they're held doesn't collapse. We think that given this is why we get all of the bad things that Boaz somehow misunderstands. Things like building roads only to the oil wells that BP controls, and not to the ones that local people in the Arabian Peninsula control or in Venezuela. It's things like Monsanto preventing Indian farmers from getting access to Delhi by making sure that trains and roads aren't built in this area, but rather only directed towards their production. Currently, we have some sort of balance. Yes, monopolies already engage in strong and biased behaviors in these areas, but the fact that local competition and the fact that local producers are strong enough because they can avoid transport costs means that there is at least to some extent competition to these big multinationals in developing countries. Once they're able to bias policies to such an extent, it is no longer possible for the small farmer that cannot compete with the speed of provision that Monsanto will be able to with this new road to get the same prices to consumers, which is why they stop farming and there's no one left in the market other than Monsanto. Let's weigh this. Number one, in the long run, this means that their harms happen to a greater extent. It means that no one is willing to fund the state, and the state has far less tax money to take because the prices that are offered to consumers initially are much higher. But secondly, I also just think that even if we get slightly less efficient policy, even if the government is slightly less incentivized, this, by diminishing returns, this matters less. Maybe the government won't construct the best bridge. Maybe the bridge will be a bit shorter, or it will be a little less safe. But it's not as guaranteed as the harm that on their side of the house, you will get competition that in the long run erodes. Thirdly, we think that competition is more long-term for the simple reason that infrastructure projects collapse or they become inefficient after a few years. Maybe a bridge doesn't answer safety regulations that we will change in a while. Maybe a tunnel that we constructed, suddenly something collapses on it and we need to construct another tunnel. But if you have gotten to a point where a river gets polluted for the reasons that I all told you, or when Monsanto is the only strong agricultural actor in India, it is unclear how in the long term they're able to avoid this harm. Second half.
Yeah, higher taxes often aren't possible because investors are going to leave. Aren't your state subsidies for states that don't have the capital right now going to take money away from things like healthcare and education?
So I'm going to engage with this in a second. I think that insofar as we prove that there's a higher interest rate in the long run, that has to be cut from things like healthcare and education, which is why, if anything, you get less of that in the long run. Last weighing I want to give on this. Their infrastructure projects might be utile for people that are near the infrastructure project. Maybe people who will use the same transport line will have a better time. But if we prove that this structurally empowers worse corporations within these countries, this leads into other areas. It means not just people in Delhi that can enjoy the transport line, also people in Mumbai or in more south that are unable to get access to products that are as cheap because Monsanto has monopolized the market. Lastly, let's talk about debt. What Ayal says is very simple. Interest rates when you take out from a private entity. No interest rates when you don't take out from a private entity. And notice the reason why interest rates are high. Once again, insofar as you believe them that the state is incapable, this allows private contractors to offer a much higher price because the state knows that it will never be able to provide something that is utile as the private contractor. Why is this really bad? Because often the times of construction, periods of construction, are in periods either when a developing country is coming back from a crisis or when it's expanding before previously being a non-developed infrastructure hub. These are very vulnerable periods where the amount of revenue that you're making as a government might not match up to the amount of expenditures when you're building up new infrastructure projects. And that means that if you spiral into an inability to pay back these loans and your credit rating gets downgraded, this is what can threaten basic things that CG talk about, like education or health in the long run, when investors also stop coming to you because they see that you can't pay back these infrastructure loans. And the infrastructure projects aren't yielding you a profit because you can't finish them because the interest rate is too high. For those reasons, we think it's much worse when you lose money in the long run. Propose.
I'd like to thank that speaker for that very fine speech, and I would like to invite the Deputy Leader of Opposition to conclude the top half of the debate. Here.
Can I bring your laptop up just in case? start?
Yeah.
For a team who is so concerned about monopolies, opening government ignores the most dangerous monopoly, the state. I think it's pretty telling that they spend most of their time analyzing why private firms are sometimes bad and very little time analyzing why governments manage these companies well, whereas we are far more balanced in analyzing both burdens. Two things in this speech. Firstly, I'm going to weigh in on the clash about economic crisis and explain why resiliency is far better under our side of the house. And then secondly, I'm going to explain why corporate management is better. Let's start with the clash about resiliency during periods of crisis. The claim that we get coming from opening government is that these companies are going to be offered bad loans from private actors, and that if this crashes, you can kind of create a 2008 type scenario within the banking system. I have a couple of responses to this. So firstly, Amitai knifes Ayal, and then he knifes himself, because they say in PM that these interest rates are going to be super high, and they're going to have to pay them off. And then in responding to our case, they say that interest rates are low. We think the more likely scenario is that interest rates are going to be pretty low for the reason that Boaz gives you. There tends to be competition where the state accepts funding from multiple different private sources. Why is there interest on the supply side for many companies who want to invest in these SOEs? Right now, in financial markets, there's a lot of attention and focus on having diversified portfolios, right? So large investment managers like BlackRock do invest in these developing countries, but they also want to hedge against this as well by investing in developed states. They want to turn to developing markets as well because the potential for capital returns tends to be a lot higher. And SOEs are the largest companies within developing states, given that they often have more resources to compete against the private sector. So this is the best way to actually diversify your portfolio. And in cases where SOEs go well, they go very well. So I'd point to the example of Bolivia's hydrocarbon sector, which has experienced massive growth in the past few decades. And if an SOE was able to get in on this deal, they would be able to hugely milk this degree of profit. Meaning that many private actors actually want to seek out this opportunity. And governments themselves aren't idiots, right? If the risk of corporate capture exists, there's not one patronage network that you rely on. There are multiple different patronage networks. So you often accept funding from multiple different sources that are going to exist, meaning that you are going to experience some kind of crisis when you need to pay off exorbitantly high interest rates that are going to exist. But secondly, what they ignore is that when companies do badly under our side, sure, maybe they need to pay some interest to these private actors, but who bails out these companies on their side? The state bails out these companies, right? It's not like you're saving money in the event of a crisis, it's just the Mexican government goes further into debt when their oil company fails. What happens under our side of the house? So we think that in developing countries, sovereign debt crisis created from things like COVID and droughts happen a lot more than 2008 banking crisis. During these periods, it is less likely to lead to a state economic collapse because as I've established, these private actors tend to be diversified, right? Like BlackRock has a variety of global investments. Even within like the domestic banking sector, note that these loans often come from foreign banks as well, from developed countries because they tend to have higher degrees of capital. Even if this company does badly, if you have a million other investments, most banks are not like most companies are not Lehman Brothers, right? They learned from 2008. Companies don't just invest in a singular housing sector. Contrast this though to the state. If the state is primarily funding and owning this company, and this company fails, it's now your obligation primarily to bail out these firms because you lack the ability of private loans. This is then likely to spiral these countries further and further into sovereign debt crisis, and their debt is likely to hugely increase during a period where they are less resilient to actually accommodate these shocks. What this looks like are massive defunding of welfare systems, not having enough money to help civilians through things like a COVID response, experiencing far higher interest rates within sovereign debt markets. We substantially prefer the concentration of risk into the private sector rather than forcing the state to bail these out. Before I talk about management, I'll take that half.
Do you think opening is right that you directly deal with these contractors for the loans, or are there like blind competition so corruption doesn't really happen? Which is it?
I'm going to respond to this within the argument about how these kind of bidding processes are likely to work. So let's talk about the incentive clash, right? I want to start by reiterating and explaining how states have bad incentives and respond to what Amitai tries to say to this. So we think that there's two kinds of states we're talking about. Firstly, in terms of dictatorial states, often there's still some degree of political competition in the sense that there's irregular elections or states are worried about internal threats like being overthrown by the military and oligarchs. What this means is that the most proximate political incentive is to guarantee that these actors are kept happy. So what happens in a country like Egypt that the military has a massive stake within the economy. What are the responses that we hear for this? Amitai says parties can scrutinize this. If this is true, parties can also scrutinize how companies are engaging in these loans, meaning that response is functionally symmetric. I think this smarter response that we hear from CG is that in cases where governments are corrupt, surely they're going to choose corrupt companies. I have a few responses to this. Firstly, accountability during a singular bidding process is a lot easier than monitoring these companies continually behind closed doors. Because these companies often receive a lot of profit and they're very important for the running of the economy, the media attention on bidding wars is absolutely massive. What you can't monitor is the daily functioning and operations of these companies. Secondly, even if you choose companies in corrupt ways, their management incentives still tend to be better than the state, right? Because what happens is that firstly, we still have multiple semi-corrupt firms who are competing against one another, but secondly, all the positive incentives that Boaz described is still applying under our side of the house. So in these cases, you're still better. In democracy though, because often this is talking about democracy, the problem that Boaz identifies is that governments are very short-termist here. So before the election, what they care the most is the BJP handing out food to their citizens to guarantee that there's going to be a high voter turnout in the election, and they're not going to adequately fund these companies, meaning there's always a risk of defunding, and in democracies, we get a clear win, there's often extremely fair and bidding processes that are going to exist. Under our side of the house, though, we explain that private actors do tend to have good incentives, right? Firstly, they often become shareholders in these companies as a way of checking against the risk of investing in these companies, meaning that they have long-term incentives, and secondly, they want to get their loans back. And they're not desperate to get their loans back, meaning that they need to capitalize this on immediately because they are very diversified. What they want is a long-term stable operations of these companies, which is also good for their reputation. So more explicit rebuttal to what they say here, they say that companies are going to create monopolies. But I think that companies are pushing for regulations and lobbying. These are often for good policies, right? Often what companies want is the abolition of bureaucracy and red tape within these countries in order to be able to expand and create businesses more easily. Often what they want are these countries to open up their markets, to be able to export products to other countries a lot more easily as well, which is actually good because it helps more citizens be able to get things at lower prices. Additionally, I think that insofar as the state is a bad monopoly, that's also hard. In terms of things like the environment, I don't know why the state will care about this, because often polluting the mother gang a river is not going to be the thing that causes the BJP to lose the election, and they also care a lot more about special interest groups. So they care about their own political groups, not everyone. Very proud to say opening opposition.
I'll just thank that speaker. That's a very fine speech. Just a reminder before the next speech to just, when you're whispering with your partners, to just try and keep the volume down a little bit, because the rooms are small and echoey. With that then, I'd like to invite the Member of Government over the back half of the debate. Here.
I think that opening government think the motion is we would rather have private companies than SOEs, and they're like, well, private companies are bad, SOEs are good. We're going to do the actual debate. Two very simple claims from closing government. One, why these SOEs get more money on our side of the house, and secondly, why they use it better. One, why do you get more money? Opening government is correct. Debt is oftentimes bad and very, very expensive, but when it's taken out by the SOEs and they loan it from private contractors directly, that's when the debt is really bad and expensive. But to some extent, obviously debt is kind of necessary, right? You can't only use taxes to fund these SOEs because it's unpopular, there's a limited pool of capital. You can try and do it, which is what OG says, but I think that's pretty unrealistic, and it's obviously just empirically not the primary way in which governments actually subsidize these state-owned companies. The way in which they do that is through government bonds, basically. So the process is as such. The question is, how does the government actually subsidize these things? What does that actually mean? Where does the budget come from? It comes from, in the vast majority of instances, government bonds, which are used to subsidize, not a private loan. So the government gets a bond and then gets money for the budget, and then they put that budget into the SOE, and so there's public funding versus the SOE going directly to private contractors and getting the loans themselves. Deficit funding is empirically the major way in which these things are funded. Why is this vastly preferable? Even compared to OO's best case, where private contractor loans are generally transparent, the government has options, etc., etc. It's because government bonds are a far better form of debt because the state has a far higher credit rating and is far more reliable as a debtor, or a creditor, I can't fucking remember which one, than the SOE. Why is that the case? It's because states tend to be far more diversified. Their economy is in a bundle of things rather than one particular industry, because they are more resilient to shock. They have more of a history of credit than these SOEs because they've been around for longer. They have links to international financial institutions like the World Bank. They are highly attractive as stable and reliable ways of institutional investors filling out their portfolio, which is why governments tend to have a far easier time at getting cheaper loans, cheaper debt than private companies, these SOEs do. Naomi says, well, private contractor loans are good because these private contractors tend to be diversified. They tend to be large banks. But we also get that under our side of the house because it is precisely these institutional investors that are buying the government bonds in the first place. But also, I would like to note also, like their rosy picture of private actors being really good probably doesn't stand. In many, many instances in the world, it just looks like a few actors coming in and dominating the local economy, like Deutsche Bank, going into numerous developing countries, and doing all of those things and getting a monopoly and offering these SOEs incredibly bad notes. So, why is getting more money extraordinarily important? It's because, as Top 5 identified, these projects are extraordinarily expensive. They tend to be long-term as per opening opposition, and so it is crucial to have excess capital to absorb those risks and to be able to keep their operation going even when you're not making a profit at every turn. And this answers the question that OG's case begs. They say opening opposition is bad because if the government doesn't have enough money, then the private loans are bad because you can't pay back interest. But if the government doesn't have enough money to pay the thing, how do they get the fucking money in the first place? The answer is obviously through these bonds. Now I'm going to answer a couple challenges from opening opposition. One, they say the government is going to use this, the SOEs are going to use this money poorly. I think this is wrong for 3 reasons. One, I think that there's electoral pressure for this funding to be done in a good way because oftentimes these are decisive issues. This looks like hospitals and railways and roads being built in your town. That is the primary issue for many, many voters. Secondly, because government bureaucrats tend to have positive incentives. They have opted for a life in the public service where they are being paid minimal amounts of money when they otherwise could have been qualified for a job in the private sector. But thirdly, these SOEs still don't want to piss away all of the government money because obviously, while we still have a larger pool of money, the money will at some point run out, like in the longer term than off bench. But still, I think this mitigates the kind of moral hazard argument that they'll keep doing pissing away money indefinitely. Then what does Naomi say? She says, well, there's sovereign debt crises. One, usually this is not necessarily that bad of a problem unless you're Argentina, because government debt tends to be overwhelmingly stable, or at least more stable than the comparative. But secondly, on their side, if the SOE goes bust, the government has to bail it out in the end anyway, and that's when you get crisis. We are less likely to get to that point because the debt that we take out is far, far more reliable and far, far cheaper. This clearly outweighs opening government. One, we are far more realistic. Secondly, we engage with OO in a higher burden. We say that even if the loans that they get are transparent, that there is competition, all of those things, government debt is still going to be far, far preferable to any of those possible options. And thirdly, we are more comparative. They say the SOE fucks over competition because they want to be competitive. But obviously they presumably want to be competitive anyway, right? Because they're a company. And so even if they are state-owned, so we are far, far more comparative. Before I go on, sure.
In cases where governments have favorable credit ratings, they will also get private debt and private loans at cheap rates because private companies think that they're going to pay it back, symmetricizing your entire case.
Why didn't you want to have the debate? It's a perverse motion, which is a fucking comparative, right? Like, we get more of one of them, you get more of the other one, and we're proving why the first one is better. I don't know what that POI means. Okay, second argument, why these SOEs are going to use the money better. The question is crucially, who has more control over borrowing on comparative? We POI LO, and he says SOE bond, what does this say? It's the SOE board, it's like the directors of these companies that decide primarily on borrowing. So what is the comparative? Under our side of the house, all of the leverage is with the central government and the relevant ministry that is funding the SOE. Who controls funding, right? They can decide whether to fund or not. Under their side of the house, it is the directors and the boards of these SOEs that have control. And no, that is distinct from more direct control by the government, right? So it's on the comparative. We have more direct oversight, more direct funding from the government. They have more leverage. The individual kind of directors of these SOEs, who are oftentimes not even government officials, are going to have more control. And that's OO's case, right? Private companies have more influence on their side of the house. DLO says maybe these investors become like shareholders in the SOEs, so presumably they have influence. Why is that worse? 3 reasons. Number one, oftentimes these directors and boards have a fiduciary duty to shareholders. That is to say, they have a duty to to deliver profit to shareholders, many of whom are not the state. In many instances, if what they're saying is true, that the private contractors become shareholders in the SOE, obviously now the board has a fiduciary duty to those stakeholders, but also to any other ones that might be investing in them. But on the outside of the house, the government is a crucial backup. They can inject extra liquidity for no interest in times of need when fiduciary duty is not being met. Why is that important? Because oftentimes the most valuable things that the state can do are not particularly profitable, are the things that provide services to people that can't pay for it, especially in the short term. Secondly, because the government has far more knowledge, because these funding things have to be decided by the government as a whole, so they take more factors into consideration. They ask and consult other ministries and experts for their opinions versus the very limited pool of knowledge that they have under their side of the house, even if you can get like advice in some abstract sense from the government. Very, very practical.
I'd like to thank that speaker for that very fine speech. Now I'd like to invite the member of opposition to continue the debate. Here.
The biggest problem in this debate is that no side has properly characterized the comparative that opens up a whole new world of harms on the government bench. It's not just government bonds, it's the AIDB and the IMF. It's terrible geopolitical actors like China, for example, that are likely to carry out extractive industries, take your ports and infrastructure when governments are desperate. The biggest problem with the opening opposition is that the incentives of governments that they outline come from one of two forms. First, media attention. Okay, look. Judge, you're an average reasonable person. Ask yourself, how much do you know about nickel mining in Indonesia? If the answer to that is not a lot, I would suggest to you that means that the amount of democratic oversight they are talking about isn't that much. I accept some democratic oversight, not that much. But the second thing I want to point out is their second point is about corruption. It's relatively unclear to me whether or not it's massive, flagrant levels of corruption in the sense of dictatorship. That seems kind of low impact to me. Not sure. Most countries seem to be relatively effective at least, or at least have good incentives. Our extension is going to take it on the highest ground and explain why civil servants, even if they are good, per what Aidan said, even if they're trying their best, have negative incentives that need to be corroborated by private actors. The last comment I want to make is on Aidan's extension. He says it's going to be government bonds because, you know, they're very capable, they're very diversified, so lots of people want to invest in governments. No. The most relevant part of this debate are areas that are trying to move from primary to secondary industries. That's why you need to build that's why you need to build infrastructure, right? The problem with that then is that many of these places are not diversified. That's the fucking point. The point is that they are often reliant on resource extractive industries and are not often trusted by large institutions. And that feeds the level to our extension that explains to you then why in many instances it's a lot more likely to be other actors. First extension then, why do we think that government enterprises need private oversight? So I want to first point out what kind of project governments do in fact fund. We think they often fund long-term projects that are not immediately seen as beneficial. How then is this distinct from opening opposition's analysis? In a number of ways. The first is long-term projects are not salient to democratic checks and balances because they often have diffuse benefits in the long term. Often the more salient electoral issues are concentrated costs. So like even things like polluting Mother Ganga, for example, is probably going to lose the BJP election more than, for example, something like I don't know, like Indian government's investment policy. But the second thing I want to point out is that governments often have massive instability, and this is why the government's policy sows the seeds for its own destruction. When governments say they are spending massive amounts of money into new infrastructural projects, opposition parties love attacking this stuff and explaining that even if it's like through all the good mechanisms that they say, love attacking this stuff and saying, oh, the government is wasting lots and lots of money. This is why when Mahathir pulled out of the high-speed rail between Kuala Lumpur and Singapore, it almost destroyed diplomatic relationships between Malaysia and Singapore. And here's the problem then, right? Everything gets fucked when governments are unstable. Everything business in that country, which is run by that sovereign wealth fund, which is run by the SOE, is not going to be trusted even by private corporations because governments often control things like laws and interest rates. etc. And that is a negative thing. The second piece of analysis I want to forward then is the incentives of civil servants. And I want to take this on its higher point. Fine, civil servants are very good people who chose to forgo a higher salary. Never mind the fact that civil servants often are the lowest rungs of their classes. They just didn't have the chance to go to BCG, so they had to take the stable rice bowl, right? Okay, that's counter-asserted. At least you mitigate against that, but I think my analysis is better. But whatever, right? More importantly, however, the point is that there are two big things. The first is civil servants often are not decided in terms of profitability, they're decided in terms of size of the budget and the relevance of projects. Internal mem take this from the guy from the most civil service country in the world, right? The point here is that civil servants often do things like write memos, write papers, write justifications, and often these justifications sound really cool, but in reality are not reflective of geopolitical context. And this is the second piece that I want to point out that's quite important as well. Civil servants move from place to place, right? Because within the civil service, you're often encouraged to move to different government ministries. So the long-term implications of that flowery essay you wrote about why a great bridge in Hambantota Airport was a good idea often just doesn't turn out to be a good thing for you either. And what that means is, on the comparative, private firms are a lot stronger because they have to stick with the consequences of the investments and the projects that they make. If that shit hits the fan, well, it's the guy who's in charge of the project that is going to have his head on the chopping board as compared to a civil servant. Because in the civil service, for example, accountability is hard to trace. There are many people involved in that project. There's a lot of power relations that are involved. So even accountability on that level is significantly worse. So here's why then we think we are significantly better. And I want to do the comparative here, right? OG says banks are bad. O says banks are good and also governments are fine. We say it's not about the argument that convinces you about the selfish, why generally selfish actors are unselfish is not the most convincing argument. The more convincing argument is they are both selfish, but they balance each other out. Here's why this matters. We think that there is a question of power asymmetry. Governments are very likely to be able to be in the negotiating table for three reasons. One, banks want governments because they are often a large, stable source of revenue that helps them do more adventurous projects. Two, governments often do things like control central bank interest rates, so they kind of want to curry favor with governments as well. They don't want to offer them bad loans. Three, even if not the case, they control things like laws that if that's the case, if they piss off governments, are often not good for them as well. As a result, the general package that is required then is one that has to be brought to the table and meet both teams in the middle, rather than one, for example, that screws over one party or the other. We think that both sides have good incentives if they check and balance. Second extension then, I want to explain why the alternative is the idea. Yeah, sure.
Off-bench doesn't engage with the fact that even if corporations are accountable and transparent, you're still going to pick the one that offers the lowest interest rate because they know they will engage in a tit for tat. You have to weigh why accountability matters more than the effect of lobbying.
But if you put a low interest rate but also said that you must pay back the loan within a shorter time frame, you might just reject it because it's not good for you. And given the power asymmetry dimension, you have the power to push and make better conditions. Second extension, AIPB. I want to first point out why this is likely to be the alternative. I want to think in many instances governments don't have the money, but crucially, government bonds take a long time in order to be carried out because you need a lot of small contributions from a wide, diverse pool of individuals. When you want to make money quickly, government bonds aren't the option. Why is this bad? First, you have significantly fewer alternatives in the sense of the AIDB because you're often hampered by geopolitical interests. For example, if you're a stan in like Kazakhstan or whatever, you have the AIDB. You're not going to get the IMF because you have the Russian bloc and no one in the IMF is going to lend to you in that context. But secondly, sometimes governments are okay with your projects failing because they are aligned with geopolitical incentives. China loved it when Hambantota Airport failed. China loved it when Pakistan's Gwada port failed because it aligns with the fact that they are able to take these ports and help their domestic industries. So this is actually the enhanced version of the OG case. Countries have interests and they're a lot more willing and able to see you fail. Banks don't, because if you fail, they have to pay that back, and many of these are based on contractual obligations over a long-term period, which they can't renege on, so they don't want to see you fail, to do everything to see you succeed. That's a comparative CO.
I'd like to thank that speaker for that very fine speech. Now I'd like to invite the government whip to make the case for their side. Here.
claim coming from closing government is simple. The comparative issue at the end of top half is that what we're dealing with in the real world is never taxes versus debt spending. It is always the case that taxes being raised are likely to A, do things like drastically increase interest rates for one, and basically shrink the economy. B, they're going to essentially impose additional economic burdens right now as opposed to doing so in the future. And C, is just not the primary way in which governments do spending these days. Even if OG is right and some of this money comes from there, it is true as a matter of framing that what we're dealing with in the vast majority of cases is a question of debt. The question is, should the debt be taken out in the name of the government or in the name of these private companies? The reason we win then is that firstly, we can convince you why it is that the government is a far more reliable actor who is able to get more debt and convince these banks to actually issue this debt, and that B, the government is far better at deciding where to put this money in the first place. Therefore, we get more money, and for good stuff as well, compared to their side, basically getting limited money for very dubious projects to begin with. What do we get from Aidan's extension, crucially then? I want to talk a bit more about the responses we get to the idea of banks having a symmetric incentive to expand these economies, or perhaps being able to essentially have more faith in the reliability of companies as debtors. What we hear from opening opposition then is largely this idea that when a debt crisis happens, you're largely worried that the government is not going to be able to pay you back, and that therefore this means that you don't think the governments are very creditworthy. The first thing I would point out is that government economic collapse in terms of credit ratings follows economic collapse, right? As in the fact that the companies and that the private sector within a country is not able to sustain itself is then the reason that bailouts happen and why governments become untrustworthy. Therefore, opening opposition is putting the cart before the horse when they say this. That is, it will be the case that if you don't trust the government anymore, it's also necessarily true that the companies won't be able to pay you back anyway. It's going to be the entire economy that is default, while the converse isn't true. It's entirely possible for an SOE to be going bust without the government being able to step in and help. Next up, we hear this idea that it's the case that you're going to be defunding welfare systems if you're putting this burden on the government. Firstly, note that this is just symmetric to the extent that the government has to pay for this on either side of the house. The question is, are you doing this through infrastructure projects, i.e. things like roads that need maintenance, things like hospitals that will require help from contractors, or would you rather be defunding the projects on their side? I would note that these things are at least equally as crucial for many of those communities. I don't think it's true that their type of issue is far worse. The issue, however, then, is that we have proven why you're just less able to get this funding in the first place. You're able to build fewer hospitals, you're able to build fewer roads, which are often necessary to accelerate the economic development of those countries. Therefore, I don't think we only get more money, but rather we make it easier for the private sector to operate and take out these loans from those private investors. Therefore, I think we're able to win on that clash as well. The next idea we hear then is that it's the case that you're able to get good rating when it's the case that directors are going to be selected through bank incentives. First here, I want to note the analysis Aidan gives you. As in, even if opening opposition is correct and that these directors are not going to be good financial actors, note what this means. It means that these companies only ever take on projects if they think that they're going to be profitable for them. The issue is that, as Aidan explains, public projects are often not done because they turn a profit. The fact you're building a new road isn't because the road in itself is profitable, but rather because of the wider economic benefits it's going to bring to the country. Private market incentives don't account for this directly, but rather you need government overhead oversight that can basically realize what it is that the economy requires to do well. Next up, we basically hear that you're able to get more competition between different actors, and that this therefore means you don't get the bad incentives. Note how this responds to our opening, right? It's probably not true that you're going to be doing tit for tat corruption in this way, but the issue is that opening opposition is reliant on the claim that you do get a variety of actors. This is premised on them proving that these companies have a good credit rating, that when you are diversifying, these are good targets for your diversification. Crucially, Aidan puts to you why it's the governments that are the actors that you're willing to trust with this kind of debt. That is, unless you have the government, you're only going to have the very big banks that can actually take on the risk of investing in SOEs. These are likely to be few in number, and that is when you get all of the issues the monopolistic terms that we've heard so far in this debate. Beyond that though, I think that there are three reasons why government investments are going to be far more safe than private company investments. Firstly, the government itself provides credit safety, right? It's far more easy to pursue the government because they cannot disappear the same way as a company does. For example, if you're a US firm, you can turn to the US government and things the international organizations to put pressure on the government to pay back its debt. Secondly, it's often the case that, as Ayal points out, the directors of these companies are basically separated, not very good actors to begin with. They don't have the credit or the reliability for people to be willing to trust those corporations. Thirdly, though, the corporate veil means that it's often easy to basically roll up the company to make the debt disappear without the government having to step in. That is, when you're worried that the government is not going to guarantee this debt, you're far less likely to trust these corporations. On our side, you're getting bonds issued in the government's name. This is a direct guarantee by the government. The government cannot simply disappear with those. Yeah.
OO wants BlackRock and private banks to hold the debt because if the SOE does badly, they have millions of other investments to help refinance. If they are an oil or coal-dependent economy and your country experiences a crisis, governments will then run out of money and worsen the crisis.
This takes me on to CO then, and this has to do with the entire claim that it's going to be the situation that, natural investments don't work as well. I have two responses here. Firstly, on the refinancing claim, you would have to prove why it's in the bank's interest to continue financing a bust project. That is, if it's the case that these projects are bad, you're far more likely to pull out, especially in times of crisis. Secondly, though, I just don't think it's true that natural resources are bad investments, as they say. For things like oil or chromium, for example, these are crucial to the world economy, and therefore they're the least likely to be the first things that go bust in the case of crisis. Therefore, I think that even if those economies are based on those, it's far more likely it's going to be reasonably safe, and the government bonds are not going to be devalued as much as they say. The next thing we hear from closing the position then is this idea of accountability. Firstly, I would just point out that when the government is accountable to a plurality or a majority, this is reason enough to think they're going to have good incentives as opposed to essentially listening to some shareholders who want to turn a profit. I think even if it's not perfect, this is enough to get some investment. Secondly, though, I think that governments themselves probably want to build those long-term projects and bring those benefits to their people. At the end of the day, it's merely a question of who is able to access the most money. On their side, SOEs are shoddy, at best you're able to get some funding, and you only spend in the small subsection of profitable projects. On our side, you get centralized oversight, and you spend in the things that the people really need. We win on scale, and we win on quality. For all these reasons, vote CG.
Thank that speaker for a very fine speech. Now I'd like to invite the opposition whip to conclude the debate.
There are two different ways for CO to win this debate. Either if we prove that the states are going to get funding from worse actors on their side of the house, or if we believe our claim that we have better incentives and therefore get these projects better done. Let's get into it. First, Gareth tells you that states need money somehow, and on their side they get it from far worse actors. The first thing I want to do is respond to closing government's main contribution on government bonds. First, this is not true. The features that Aidan gives are not features of developing countries, which are the main goal of this debate, because they are the ones that focus on development and infrastructure, which are more risky, have a lower credit rating, and are less diversified. The previous speaker tells us oil is a risky investment. Look at Venezuela, bro. This is clearly not a stable investment. They don't have good credit ratings. I think just factually looking at the world can tell you this, right? Government bonds in Zimbabwe and Myanmar are not in high demand. If they give you structural reasons, we give you structural reality. That's why this clearly doesn't exist. The previous speaker then says, if the government goes bust, so do SOEs. This is only in the case of a collapse, which is in the minority cases of projects going bust. On their side, the government can spend this money however they want. They can buy Isabella Marcos handbags. They can host the World Cup. They can do all sorts of bad things with their money, which make it far less trustworthy. On our side, when you have an SOE directed towards a specific development of infrastructure, it's far more trustworthy for private firms to go in, especially because as opposed to the whole government, where you have government bonds, as an investor, you have much more oversight into that project. So on the comparative, you're far less likely to invest in government bonds than you are into our projects. The final thing they say is that private firms won't invest in non-profitable projects. This is wrong. For every unprofitable project that needs to be made, there are many other profitable projects, which means that for both to happen, you need trust in a loan package. Banks are far happier to give good lending to public projects when they build relationships with their SOE through these bigger projects. And finally, the previous speaker just makes things up. Since when the international organizations pressuring governments to pay back private lenders ever work? Look at Egypt, look at Argentina, look at Pakistan. This clearly doesn't work. What is the impact of all of this? They don't get government bonds. No thank you. Secondly, even if you do get government bonds, it's not good enough.
Developing countries run with deficits anyways, which means that for a long-term massive development project, they need massive capital outlay, which means it's not enough to just finance a deficit. You need something extra to push you over the top. So even if they get government bonds, which we don't think they have enough funding. What is the impact of all of this? It returns to where governments need this investment from. Gareth tells you they get from the AIDB, they get from the IMF. The extent of their response was their extension. I've taken it down. What are the impacts of all of this? Because there are separate spheres of power, there's no competition. Because these are international organizations, there's far bigger power asymmetry, which means that you get worse loan terms, which also flips OG. Because even if you believe that debt is always bad, we tell you that debt is more expensive on their side of the house. Second, you're forced into far worse concessions, like permanently giving up your port. Third, banks only want to see a return on your investment, whereas other actors extract political concessions that harm real people. It means you don't vote on UN motions to tell China to stop harming Uyghurs. It means that you implement harsh austerity conditions on your own citizens. Fourth, and most crucially, no thank you. They want to see your project fail. Banks want your project to succeed to get a return on their investment. Political actors want to see your project fail so they can extract concessions. This beats CG again, because even if the comparative is government debt versus private debt, we tell you governments get debt from these worst actors, that's very bad. On weighing, no thank you. Even if this claim is more speculative than the other stuff we bring you, the scale of impact of permanent political and economic damage is so massive. Compare that to OO, where their entire claim is just there might be a little bit more corruption in an already very corrupt country. This is clearly a far better impact. Even if you don't believe all of that, hold on. Secondly, SOEs have better incentives with private lenders on our side. There are two gaps in OO that Gareth fills. First, that the case is a little bit tense. They say that at the same time, banks have leverage over governments to not make them be corrupt, but governments also have leverage over banks because they have lots of lenders and competition. It's not my job as closing to tell you which is true, but our case avoids that tension. Second, and more importantly, their case only works in terms of illiberal, corrupt states. Gareth's analysis applies to all states, so we engage with GovBench on a higher burden. CG, a few responses. No, thank you. First, on electoral incentives. Gareth flips this. He says that long-term projects with diffuse benefits are the first to go with short-term political cycles. But moreover, we explained to you that civil servants have very bad incentives because they want the biggest budgets, the longest projects. They want a sense of power because they are overseeing this very, very highly funded project. We tell you that their incentive is to make the project last as long as possible, as expensive as possible, whereas the bank's incentive is to make it as cheap as possible, as quick as possible. Crucially, the comparative is this. It is not public oversight versus private oversight. It's public oversight versus both. And that is why Gareth's extension works. This fiduciary duty to shareholders is also a myth, right? It's a state-owned industry, guys. They're accountable to their minister, to their permanent secretary, who have the exact same incentive, to increase their budgets, to prove that they're spending money, and therefore they want it to be more expensive. No thank you. Impact. SOEs have to reduce cost and improve quality on our side of the house. Again, we beat OG on that argument because it costs less on our side of the house, and maybe we get a safer bridge, which I assure you is a very, very important thing to people's lives. What do we have left from CG? We've taken out the fiduciary duty to shareholders. We've told you government bonds are not an option. We don't think they have much left. Before I take OG, I'll take PR on OG.
We say governments take very cheap loans in exchange for tit-for-tat projects. CG say governments take bonds, knifing our premise of what types of loans are offered and taken by governments.
Sure. Okay. OG have two claims left, right? So I think you know nothing left from CG. What we have left from OG? The first is saying that projects are built in a way that is bad because it's what the private industry wants. One, the comparative is not better. Governments build industries in their base of power, which means that they don't build in opposition districts, and crucially, they don't build in racial minorities. Two, our comparative is, even if there are perverse incentives, the bank's perverse incentives are probably better, right? Because they want to build in underdeveloped areas. They want to build in poor communities. Why? Because it's a developing market there. It's very profitable. On their side, they're just going to consolidate the same set of power, the same set of majority elite interests. Third, Gareth's extension beats this. Other than building, sorry, I can't read this. So instead of building near one of the many diverse manufacturing plants that the bank owns, they build near the one specific port that China owns. That's very, very bad. Final argument that debt is bad. I know everyone is trying to make fun of OG, but I'm fine, alright? So, this is obviously not true, right? That is okay when you don't have the capital, but at the same time, you are developing your industry further in the future. Which means that if you are able to take the debt to develop this industry and get more money from the government, you are able to pay back in the future. Also, debt is bad, it's just such a bad argument. If you want to buy a house, if you want to buy a car, all companies raise capital sometimes, debt is bad, it's just a very, very bad argument. OG themselves say that this is a moment when countries have no capital and are developing into the future. Why are you voting CO? Other than the fact that I don't think any other team has a very strong impact, we give you two. First, the incentives are better, which means we get cheaper and better projects. Second, the governments have to get money from somewhere. Government bonds are an option, their own taxpayers are an option. We prove it's very bad actors, which means all becomes a government worse. Your vote is zero.
I'd like to thank that speaker for that very fine speech, and everyone for us fantastic debate. Step outside, shake hands, close around, so bring your stuff with you and don't come back. Best of luck.